die.
To keep doing daily videos on YouTube, I need to raise my Patreon and Subscribestar income to a grand total of $200 a month. So if you're so inclined, help a chap out. Zang. Most of the time, I try to get along with people, even if I disagree with them. But in the situation in which we currently find ourselves with the whole virus problem, there isn't really the capacity to do that, because there are lives at stake. And many people, even those they call friends or colleagues or whatever else, are promulgating dangerous stupidity.
Yeah, sure, it might be scientifically wrong. It might not. But we don't know until further testing is done, and how long is that going to take? Well, a while, isn't it? I mean, they're hitting warp speed on this testing of this drug, but it could show in weeks whether it works. Well, we've got hundreds of people dying every day in this country. Why don't we just give it to them and see if they don't die?
Because that's not how science works. That's certainly not how medicine works. And you just shoring up Trump's nonsense about chloroquine just to throw some red meat to your followers, rather than hoving to any kind of principle. You used to call yourself a skeptic, right? So you should know that there's a reason science is conducted in a particular way, medicine is conducted in a particular way. We don't just throw drugs around willy-nilly without testing them.
Isn't that rather unethical behaviour?
Oh, is it? I'm afraid I'm a bit out of touch.
Whether it be rugged individualism, viruses don't care if you consider yourself to be a cowboy or an individualist, they'll kill you, and worse, you don't just exist as an individual, certainly not when it comes to microbes and pathogens. Yeah, you can pass them on to other people, which forces us to understand that we exist within a social context where many of our actions can impinge on other people and even kill them. There's the idea being spread around that freedom from is somehow inherently authoritarian, while freedom to isn't, which is clearly nonsense. If we consider someone's freedom to, for example, act upon their religious prejudices towards certain races, as the LDS Church used to, or against genders, as we see in many forms of Islam, or to treat homosexuals poorly, as we see in Christianity quite often. We can see how letting those people act upon those authoritarian and authoritative, I guess, hierarchical demands for their religion onto other people tends to lend itself to authoritarianism and discrimination and just generally treating people like shit. Philosophically, I'm an anarchist, so that means I'm guided by what provides the greatest freedom to the greatest number of people. And freedom from tends to affect a lot of people, and freedom to tends to only affect a bare minimum of people. So your freedom to own a gun impinges upon many people's freedom from being randomly shot in a mass shooting, or living in a society that isn't awash with guns, leading to more and more deaths and suicides and accidents and all the rest of it. So the grim calculus there is quite easy to see. It gets a bit more fiddly when it comes to other things, but by and large, freedom from tends to win. Yeah, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness rather suggests that we need to protect people's freedom from dying, from having their liberties impinged upon, and in order to act on any liberties, you kind of need to be alive. And to pursue happiness, you need to be free from a lot of the other demands on your time. Look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs and consider where the pursuit of happiness comes on that scale. And you can then see how, if we collectively provide for the things lower down the scale, that frees people up, provides them the liberty to pursue happiness. It seems somehow obvious to me in a way that it perhaps isn't to other people. don't think they think it through. I think it's just a knee-jerk reaction. This idea that the shutdown is somehow a bad idea is also being spread around by a lot of people, with the idea that the economic downturn that is coming is somehow going to be worse than the disease would be. Now, a lot of this seems to come about because our efforts to contain and control the disease have been effective, and people look at the current state of affairs and think, oh, well, we needn't have panicked so much. While, in fact, yeah, that's survivor bias in a way. You're looking at the situation because we made all those efforts. Now, poverty does kill people, and our actions are going to induce poverty and create problems. Not as bad as people think. I think any recovery is likely to be rather swift, certainly swifter than the Great Depression, which took about 10 years to recover from. But we can actually put numbers on this, at least vaguely. So poverty currently, directly or indirectly, kills about 14 million people annually globally who wouldn't die if they weren't in a state of poverty, or at least wouldn't die so soon if they weren't in a state of poverty. For most of those, a global depression or recession has no real material effect on their way of living. They're already at the absolute bottom of society, picking through garbage heaps for recyclables or whatever else it might be. So for most of those people, this isn't going to make any difference. And this global depression, global recession, is really going to concentrate its effect, its unemployment, its relative levels of poverty in more developed first world nations, most of which have some kind of safety net in place. So you'll be able to get by, at least. So we're unlikely to see an enormous uptick in suicides or poverty-related diseases or poverty-related deaths. Now, austerity has been a massive killer, but that's unnecessary impoverishment. What we're experiencing now is a necessary impoverishment to control the disease. So, we've got quite a bit of leeway there. So anything over 14 million global people being killed by the disease, we can take that as a kind of benchmark per year. That's our allowance, maybe, to double it. If we hadn't taken the actions that we've taken against the coronavirus, the mass testing, the shutdowns, the social distancing and so on, early estimates were that it would have infected about 60% of the global population just in this first wave, and that about, it runs from anywhere from 1.5 to 3% of those people would die. Split the difference, call it 2%. So that would have, if we hadn't taken the actions we've taken, that would have killed about 91,128,000 people in the world. So that's about equivalent to 1428, a good half decade or more of regular poverty deaths. So that's what we'd be looking at if we hadn't done anything. Now, admittedly, America, where most of the stupidity appears to be concentrated, they will probably be worse off than the rest of the world because they don't have a decent welfare safety net. They tend to just let people hang, particularly poor people. They tend to blame poor people for being poor and tend to lionize billionaires as though they somehow worked harder or had some rare amount of talent that other people don't, which is pretty goddamn far from the case, really. They tend to get where they are either through inheritance, it's about a third of them, or off the backs of the work of others. There are a handful of genuinely brilliant people, but by and large it all boils down to luck. Whether that's luck in business or luck in the family that you were born into. But in America, where you don't have the safety nets, you don't have the more communitarian socialist thinking that the rest of the developed world has, there's more of an argument there that you're going to get fucked over.
Many men, of course, became extremely rich, but this was perfectly natural and nothing to be ashamed of because no one was really poor, at least no one worth speaking of.
But again, America doesn't exist in isolation. This is a global disease. This is a global thing we need to worry about. There's a few things in social science and economics. There's not a lot, but there's a few things that we can say that we know, like climate change is real. Social investment is more cost effective than police enforcement is. Socialised healthcare works better, is cheaper, and results in better outcomes for the vast majority of people than relying on private medicine. We know these things. It's not controversial. It's only controversial when it comes to politics. So we're not being led by people who understand the science. We're not being led by people who will take the time to educate the public on what the science is and why a particular policy is the best way forward, rather than engaging in vindictive stupidity. There's a lot of ideological inertia that gets in the way of us doing the obviously right thing in a lot of cases. But, disasters might loosen that up a bit. But we do know how to get out of major economic depressions. And unfortunately for the right, what we do know is that the way out is massive government spending, social investment, big projects. The New Deal is one of the starkest examples of that. That is what began to cut short the Great Depression and accelerate America out of it. And in much of the rest of the world, similar kinds of projects followed on. Now, people who don't like socialist thinking and will sort of adjust history in a way that they want it to look, by saying that no, it wasn't the New Deal, it wasn't massive government spending, it was World War II. Well, yeah, but what happens in a total war situation, in a mass mobilization situation? The government spends a shitload of money. So war is really no different, economically speaking, being planned economy, massive amounts of spending and so on, to what preceded it, except that a lot of people end up dead. So of the two options, which amount to the same thing economically, one is clearly far preferable to the other. And in case I need to spell it out to you, because you're being particularly dense today, that is massive government spending and investment without the war. Now, after the Great Depression, there was a rise globally in authoritarian communism, but also authoritarian fascism. So the authoritarians on both left and right. But we're not really seeing a rise in communism, for all a lot of people LARP at that sort of thing. I think this is largely because the left has become so ensnared in social justice and identity politics that it has forgotten its economic roots. And even so, socialism is not the same thing as Marxism or communism. I think Marxism is completely discredited, much like trickle-down economics is utterly discredited. But there are leftist economic ideas, mostly contained within socialism rather than Marxism or communism, that we know work. The left hasn't particularly been fighting its own corner particularly hard on that, and the right, weirdly, has been willing to embrace some of those ideas, though channeled through their standard cronyism and corruption, which is why we've seen easy trillion-dollar payouts to prop the stock market up for less than 24 hours, but getting help for people who actually do anything, workers, makers, people like that, people who actually run the economy. That's been a lot more difficult, even though the right has kind of embraced the idea, at least temporarily. They're very much dragging their feet. But we are seeing this dangerous rise in this economic right wing, the lolbertarian right wing, the people who are demanding they should be allowed to go back to work despite an ongoing global deadly pandemic. These kind of protests demanding that America reopen, they're also crossing over with a lot of my freedom to trumps your freedom from sort of people like Pastor Greg Locke, who wants to be free to discriminate and be horrendous to LGBT people and so on. They're also demanding that they be allowed to go to church, thereby murder other people, or in other cases to go and get ice cream or whatever else it might be. All of these people think that the government, even though it's their government at the moment in a lot of places around the world, isn't going to let go of these emergency powers once the problem has passed. I think that's profoundly unlikely, at least in democratic countries. I think they will back off from this. I think, and I'm saying that thinking that's less likely with the authoritarian right-wing conservative fuck the poor people that we currently have in power in the US, UK and many other places. Even them, who I think are less likely to give it up, I think are going to give it up. But how many lives is it worth for you to go and infect other people just so you can go and effectively write a letter to Santa by attending church? How many lives is it worth to add a digit or two to a billionaire's spreadsheet bottom line? How many lives is it worth for you to be able to visit Baskin Robbins and get the ice cream that you want? I'm going to say 0. 0 lives. I mean, if we go back to the statistics on how many people would have been killed, yeah, most of us have some sort of relationship. We can identify 100 people that we know. That's our monkey sphere, if you like. At least one of those people would die if we hadn't taken these controls. So if you make a list of 100 people that you know, that you have some kind of relationship with, pick a random number, 1 to 100, look at that person and ask yourself, is it worth just letting that person die for my convenience? I'm going to say no. I don't think this is a hard decision. I don't think it would be a hard decision if it was a total stranger. I don't think these things are worth anybody dying. Especially if we can get by, if we can cope. And we know the way out of this. History demonstrates it. The science demonstrates it. In as much as science could be said to exist in economics or sociology. We know. And a mass pandemic, deaths of people, that meets the harm principle, which is the only real justifiable means that we can use to extend constrictions upon people. This is why I find these kind of constrictions acceptable, despite being a philosophical anarchist and inherently anti-authoritarian and anti-hierarchical. I can accept these because the consequence is dead people. Whereas free speech, you can just not listen, or you can turn it off, or you can look away, or whatever else. Offensive speech doesn't rise to the level of the harm principle. Spreading the flu, or any other disease to other people, does. And this is like vaccination issues. If you don't want a vaccination, if that only affected you, that would be fine. But it doesn't. It affects other people, people who are immunocompromised and so on. Which is why we demand vaccinations of people. Why they probably should be compulsory. Because it's not just you that gets hurt when you don't take your vaccinations, when you spread anti-vax bullshit. Lives are ended or crippled as a consequence. And so it is here. If it just affected you, hey, that's evolution in action. For you to go to church and cough on everybody, fine. The world lost another idiot and a bunch of other idiots around them. So fucking what? The world has improved. The gene pool is improved by that happening. Unfortunately, this doesn't work that way because you can spread it to people who aren't pathologically stupid. So, I'm sorry, but for the greater freedom and greater good of everybody, you're going to have to be mildly inconvenienced for a while. And after all, when you're dead, you can't exercise any rights. So for fuck's sake, grow up. It's only going to be a few more months. Maybe a year till we get the vaccine. Zang. It's been called misogynistic, racist, a hate group, reactionary. It's been blamed for Trump, for keeping women out of games and technology. None of this is true. If you want the real story, then you need to buy Inside Gamergate.
I didn't wanna hurt you, baby. I didn't wanna hurt you. I didn't wanna hurt you, but you're pretty good when you cry.
happen. This is not a time to be dismayed. This is punk rock time. This is what Joe Strummer trained you for. It is now time to go. You're a good person. That means more now than ever.